I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
Welcome back to another episode of Heavy Board. My name is Andrew Whitstadt, and today we're finishing the complete poems of Emily Dickinson. The same book we'd been doing already, the same edition, all of that good stuff. And we're going to round this out today. We're going to finish it off. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you'll know that I am solo today. Sophie couldn't make it, so I am here to finish this out solo. So again, listeners chime in. We love hearing from you, love hearing from our listeners, and all that good stuff. But today we're going to finish out the rest of Emily Dickinson's complete poems. And as we've already said, as we've done a couple times already, we've broken this up into chunks. So this is the last couple, or the last two, so this is the last 200 pages of Emily Dickinson's complete poems. Again, these are all in order for the most part, and we're going to get into some of these. Unfortunately, we don't have Sophie's half for it, but you guys will just have to deal with me. There's that. So we're going to go into this. We're going to get into some of these poems. Hopefully we'll have a little conversation. As always, put your thoughts in the comments. Send us an email. I'd like to hear from you, all that good stuff. But before we get started, let me do the housekeeping here before I forget. Reminder to listeners, we're still looking for workshop horror stories. If you or someone you know had a terrible experience in a writing workshop or any type of art workshop, send that in excruciating detail to heavywordpodcast@gmail.com. For those that don't know, we offer a subscription plan. Subscribe to this podcast at patreon.com/heavyboard, and you'll receive full uncensored episodes, bonus episodes, extra content, all for subscribers only. Check that out, listeners. If you don't want to do that, can't afford it, there are other ways to support us. You can leave us a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check out our YouTube channels. We have a main channel where we post all free episodes. You can give that a like, a subscribe, a share. That helps us out. We also have a clips channel where you can do the same thing. You don't have time, you don't want to listen to the full episode. We put clips out there for free on YouTube, Heavyboard Clips. That's at Heavyboard on YouTube and at Heavyboard Clips. Give those a like, a subscribe, a share. That helps us out, helps us grow. It's a free way to support us. And as always, we'll have all the links to everything we cover in the description. I'm going to go through my notes, and I have about, let's say, I got like 4 pages. 4 pages of notes, roughly, on this. And we're gonna work it out. We're going to get there. Got a fresh coffee, fresh vape. Here we go. One of the things I noticed before I go into the poems here, I have a list of poems, as always, I have the stuff I want to go over, but what I really want to focus on here with this last section of Emily Dickinson is the decline. And I don't mean, listeners don't take this the wrong way, I don't mean decline in terms of her skill, but I think it's obvious as we read these last 200 pages that Dickinson, that she was starting to lose it, whether that's, due to illness, whether that's due to her mental health condition. As a lot of listeners know, and we've said on previous episodes, she was kind of a hermit towards the end of her life. The last 10, 15 years of her life, she really locked herself in her bedroom and didn't come out. And I think the work suffered for it. You start to see things like spiders come up, dusts in corners, things that are around her room. And I don't mean to say that she's going away from nature and things like that, but she's clearly kind of focusing less on nature. It does, a lot of the poems feel like, oh, it's nature, but it was nature witnessed through, a window that was opened in a bedroom. It was not her earlier stuff where she could go out into fields, or at least felt comfortable going out into fields and making observations in her poetry and things like that. So there is this little bit of decline. So you'll hear me go into this. And I want to be clear here when when we say decline, we don't mean bad, right? I don't mean to say that, oh, she sucks. No, you shouldn't read it. No, I mean to say, compared to the other 500 pages of poetry in this collection, this last 200 shows the decline. And you can see this with every writer. You can see this with Shakespeare, right, where he just wrote these masterpieces and then just stopped writing. There's speculation he was ill. People underestimate how much energy goes into creating something like this. You want to write a play? You want to write a novel? You want to write a collection of poems that's coherent, complete? Like, that takes a lot of fucking energy, man. That takes a lot of time, energy. It takes a lot of willpower, a lot of discipline to do something like this. These are very difficult creative endeavors, and anyone who views them lightly is not viewing them correctly, at least in my eyes. They're not viewing them correctly. But I do want to, and I'll highlight this as we go along, I do want to highlight some of the decline that she's having, at least obviously present in her work. So we left off at page 500, and we're around 1867. And as I mentioned in previous episodes, listeners, 1867, her production is going down. So that first, hold on, let me find it in the pages, bear with me. 1865 was the last kind of packet of poems sewn together that we saw. And that was around 84 poems composed in the year 1865, and this is way down from her peak in 1862, where you heard Sophie and I go into this. In 1862, she wrote 366 poems. 366 poems. Whew, that's a lot. That is a lot. That is more poems than there are days, right? That's basically a poem a day. In 1862. And then she kept it up. 1863, 140, 1864, 172, and then 1865, she had 84. She starts declining. There was a peak, and then it goes down. This is why I brought up the sustainability, the energy, the thing it takes to write an entire collection. It takes a toll. It takes a toll. And I don't mean it takes a toll in terms of like, oh, I'm losing my ability. I've lost my gift. No, I mean it takes a toll in terms of endurance. You'll see this with a lot of writers. What happens? And they burn out. They burn out because, one, there could be mental health issues. There could be other illnesses, such as Dickinson had here, right? A lot of authors that get diagnosed with cancer. T.S. Eliot, when he got diagnosed with emphysema and died of it, was not producing the stuff he was producing in his 40s, right? He was well into his 70s. He's, lung cancer, heavy smoker, all that kind of shit. He just wasn't producing the same stuff. Not that he was burning out, but it's difficult to say that anyone can just do this. It's also difficult to keep it going, if that makes sense. Again, listeners, chime in. So we left off at around 1867, around there, and these are the later years, right? Keep in mind. And then we quickly move into 1868. I've noticed, again, throughout this selection of poems, these last 200 pages, there's a lot of unfinished work. Especially around 1868 is when we know that a lot of these poems are unfinished. It's written into the book. There's a little note underneath the circa 1868 for a few of these poems. We're going to go into a few of them, where it just says in parentheses, quote unquote, unfinished. And those are just the ones that they know were unfinished, or at least Johnson, the editor of this book, knew they were unfinished. But I got the vibe that a lot of these poems in the last 200 pages here were unfinished. They were fragments. They were pieces. They weren't, she either didn't have the energy or, she was too mentally unstable to go back and rewrite and edit. At least like she was in, let's say, the year 1862, 1863, where she pretty much her peak. She peaked. You heard us do this on the podcast. We had to cut it down to 100 pages in the 1862 section because there was it was too much. It was too many bangers. There were too many great poems. But here's all right, let's get into some of these poems and we'll keep talking. Okay, the first one I marked is on page 502, number 1115. And this one was just the first one to spark me. I didn't have a whole lot of note on it, but then I had to move into the unfinished ones here on the next page. But let's just go over it. The murmuring of bees has ceased, but murmuring of some, posterior, prophetic, has simultaneous come. The lower meters of the year, when nature's laugh is done, the revelations of the book, whose genesis was June. Appropriate creatures to her change, the typic mother sends, as accent fades to interval, with separating friends, to what we speculate has been, and thoughts we will not show, more intimate with us become than persons that we know. Damn. This one is, it didn't hit me like this when I marked it, when I was reading through this over the last couple weeks. But rereading this, as accent fades to interval, with separating friends, to what we speculate has been, and thoughts we will not show, more intimate with us become than persons that we know. This idea, there's definitely a death vibe in this, but then there's this idea of loss, separating friends, and as I already mentioned, I'm doing this solo, and that's just hitting me right now. As accent fades to interval with separating friends, till what we speculate has been, right, always will be, and thoughts we will not show, more intimate with us become than persons that we know. Goddamn, Emily Dickinson was great. I wish I had more comment on that. Actually, I shouldn't talk about it at all right now. Okay, the next one I wanted to go into. Page 503. And this is number 1119. And this is one that was marked as, this is the first one that's marked as unfinished. And there's a few others that are also marked as unfinished. So 1119 on page 503. Paradise is that old mansion many owned before, occupied by each an instant, then reversed the door. Bliss is frugal of her leases. Adam taught her thrift. Bankrupt once through his excesses. And then it just ends. There's a little M dash and it ends, and then it's like, oh, it's unfinished. And you can tell it's unfinished. You can tell it's unfinished by the way I read it. You can tell it's unfinished just by reading it on the page here. Looking at how small it is compared to a lot of her other poems, you can tell it's unfinished. It doesn't have that completeness that makes the circle. And now that we've hit this, let's get into a couple other unfinished ones. Now, there's another unfinished poem on page 507, number 1131, The Merchant of the Picturesque. And this one's labeled as unfinished. And like I said, there's ones that are labeled unfinished, and then there are ones that just feel unfinished. They feel like little fragments. For example, 1127 on page 506, I'm seeing it right now. Soft is the massacre of sons, by evening sabers slain. And that's it. It's 2 lines. There's no punctuation. It just, it isn't Dickinson. It isn't her peak. It isn't what we've come to know about Dickinson. But I'll get back to this because 1129 is Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. Something we went into on our bonus episode. And again, listeners, if you want to hear that, patreon.com/heavyboard. But you'll hear us go into something like this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but that's one of her more famous ones, Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. And that looks like it was composed in between that little tiny fragment of 1127 and this kind of longer unfinished one, 1131. I'll get to that in a minute. But we have these kind of unfinished poems, and it starts around 1868 that it appears she's not finishing poems anymore. So something's going on, right? Now, we can speculate. Listeners know, I have feelings when we start speculating about the lives of writers. When we start using biography to explain artistic projects away, to either give them meaning or take meaning from them, and a lot of times now you'll see they'll use biography to discredit great works of art because the author isn't a 2023 Democrat or liberal or something like that. So this is what it, and I'm speaking of U.S. politics, listeners, when I say that. So that's basically what it is If you saw that thing on Picasso this past week, you'll know what I'm talking about. Whereas what matters is not Picasso's art, but what matters is his politics, personality, everything he did. Because again, we have no critics. Critics don't have anything to say. So they talk about politics. They specifically talk about DNC politics. That's what they talk about. And that's how they grade art. They use this kind of rubric from, again, one side of the aisle to determine what art is worth remembering, what art is worth whitewashing in the Dahl case, Agatha Christie case, Ian Fleming case, right? There are these conscriptions that just, these people aren't educated. They don't understand what they're talking about, so they talk about biography. This is a crutch. When you talk about biography instead of the work on the page, you're talking about a crutch. So I don't really want to speculate. That's a long way of saying, I don't really want to speculate about her personal life. One, it's impossible to know. Two, I think it's very easy to get bogged down on something like that. It's very easy to say, oh, well, Emily Dickinson is she was sick or something, and that's why. Well, that could be true, but it's not doing the work that I think people intend it to do. I think it's a crutch. It's going halfway and saying you went all the way, saying that you use this one thing to go all the way, and they don't usually. So I don't want to get into speculation as to why she might, but you can tell she's losing it. You can just read it on the page. That's all the evidence you need. You don't need to go into her illness. You don't need to go into her kind of insanity, her kind of agoraphobic, last 10, 15 years of her life. You just need to read the poems. They're right in front of you, and you can see them start to fall apart. You can see them start to fail. You can see them be unfinished. And this is what we have here on poem 1131 on page 507. So I'll just read this again. It says unfinished. The merchant of the picturesque, a counter has and sails, but is within or negative, precisely as the calls. To children he is small in price, and large in courtesy. It suits him better than a check, their artless currency. Of counterfeits he is so shy, do one advance so near, as to behold his ample flight, M dash, and that's it, right? That's it. So it's clearly unfinished. We just don't have anything else here. And this only starts in 1868, when she clearly stopped being as productive, when she, again, we can speculate, she started to have these kind of mental health issues, but we're only speculating about that. And we end up with these kind of, you can read on the page, these unfinished works, these clearly kind of fragments, bits of poems that haven't come together, that she maybe didn't have the energy or time to rework, or, maybe she just lost the passion. Again, after what I've read of Dickinson and how he rejected a lot of her work, like a moron, I have no doubt that she lost a little bit of that spark. It's hard to keep that up, as a lot of aspiring writers know. But yeah, there's another unfinished one on the very next page, 508, poem 1132. The smoldering embers blush, O hearts within the coal. Hast thou survived so many years? The smoldering embers smile, soft stirs the news of light. The stolid seconds glow, one requisite has fire that lasts. Prometheus never knew. And that's it, right? It ends, drops off the face of the earth, drops it off. And my question about this is that it all starts in 1868, and what I would normally ask Sophie here, my co-host, but I'm going to ask the audience here and then try to get my own answer. Why do we think this is? Why do we think that towards these last 200 pages, the end of her life, she got worse? And I don't mean, oh, she got bad, it's not worth reading, which a lot of people say. Notice everybody who says you shouldn't read something has not read the book in question. Just want to point that out there too. So usually when somebody tells you don't need to read something because, oh, it's terrible, or oh, because the author, 150 years ago had bad politics, according to today's standards, right, that DNC rubric of grading art, you don't have to listen to them. They literally, they've never read the book they're talking about. They've just repeating what they heard, whether they heard that on social media, whether they heard it from their hack professors at some point that, oh, you don't need to read this book because this guy's an asshole, or he was mean to women, he was misogynist, whatever it is. He didn't vote Democrat correctly, whatever it is. Just, there's things people say. All right, I gotta open up a new jewel pod here, and I forget what I was saying about that. Don't listen to anything I say, you know. Who gives a shit? Let's go back a page to page 506, where we have 1129. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And this is one of her most famous and, you know, one of her best. One of her best because it gets at something that is true. And I know it's a recurring theme on the podcast. Everyone wants to say, oh, it's true. Oh, it's honest. And my question is always, what does that mean? We need to go a little deeper than just, oh, it's true. Oh, it's representing something true. I'm like, no. It's fiction, right? Not necessarily in the case of poetry here, because, you know, poetry can be fiction, but in this case, you know, it doesn't always have to be. But I do kind of come back to this idea of tell all the truth, but tell it slant, right? And I think, and you can hear this on some of our previous bonus episode, listener, where Sophie and I get into it a little bit about what this poem is talking about. A lot of people claim death because they latch on to her other poems, because again, there is a lot of speculation, there's a lot of arguments, a lot of bad faith interpretation, I think, and a lot of speculation. You'll even see it when you read the Wendler book that we've been using as a companion for this. You know, she goes off into the realm of speculation. She's very honest about it, which most good scholars are honest about stuff like this, but, you know, this is what it is. Had to turn the fan on in here. It's getting a little warm. Okay, so this is one of her most famous ones. We've covered it before, let's cover it again. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And then so we say truth. What does she mean by truth here? What I think she means by truth is literally when new information is introduced to somebody. Let's say you have a conviction. Let's say you think something, and then you're introduced with a truth that proves what you think is wrong. Think of religion. So I guess you could talk about religious context. And in the Wendler book, as we've said all 4 of these episodes, she goes pretty heavily into the religious readings on a lot of this. And no doubt Dickinson was sticking it to the cloth in that regard, as I brought up every single episode so far. But I think that also can be limiting. I think the idea of putting it in a religious context can limit the meaning of this poem. This poem is broader than just the religious context. This poem is broader than just the truth that all things die. This poem is broader than that. And I'm not saying it's broad in a bad way, right? It's actually broad in a very specific way, right? Too bright for our infirm delight, right? Our limited mortal understanding, our infirm delight, it's too bright for us. It's too much, overwhelming, right? Blinds us. The truth's superb surprise, which is often not what you think it is, right? We do this as human beings. We construct these kind of ideas in our head. They're like, oh, well, that's why they're doing it. But actually, it's not, right? There might be other reasons. There might be explanations that we just don't know about yet. So it's about overcoming ignorance. This is a great theme in all of, you know, Western philosophy and really all philosophy throughout humanity is we're searching for the truth, right? We're searching for something real. We're searching for someone to help us see the light that's too bright for our little infirm delight or our mortal little pleasures, right? And I don't want to go too far into this, but just keep that in mind. It's a good one to memorize. It's a good one to have in your bank of memorized poems. And it's interesting that this one is dated between all of these unfinished poems as they start to come up in 1868 here. Make of that what you will, listeners. But again, we like to hear from you, so chime in. You think that there's something I'm missing, something that I didn't see, please, I'd love to hear from you. And again, I want to reemphasize, I don't stand by almost anything I say on this. So that's not true, because sometimes I do. It depends, right? This is a podcast. This is a medium where I give you my thoughts at any given day, and those thoughts can change. Those thoughts can be reshaped. Those thoughts can be presented with new information and force me to do something different. But that's what this is. This is a working out of thinking through. This is the rough draft of reading. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. These are my opinions. Opinions change, all of that. So again, I'm perfectly willing to hear an argument. All right, next one that I wanted to cover, page 535, number 1213. And this is one where we have two different versions. Again, we have an 1872 version and we have an 1878 version. And we've talked about this on the subsequent episodes and we start to get into the kind of not knowing, right? So look at how this is. So we started in 1868. 30 pages later, we're in 1872. 1872. 1872, 1878. These things are interspersed here. And it just shows how little she wrote after that big productive section in that kind of ends in 1865 there. All right. But I'll read both versions of these and I'll talk about how we do this. So, we like March, his shoes are purple, he is new and high. Makes he mud for dog and peddler, makes he forests dry. Knows the adder tongue his coming, and presents her spot. Stands the sun so close and mighty, that our minds are hot. News is he of all the others, bold it were to die, with the bluebirds exercising, on his British sky. And that's the version of 1872. Okay, so here's the revised version. We like March, his shoes are purple, he is new and high. Makes he mud for dog and peddler, makes he forests dry. Knows the adder's tongue he's coming. Knows the adder's tongue his coming, and begets her spot. Stands the sun so close and mighty, that our minds are hot. News is he of all the others, bold it were to die, with the bluebirds buccaneering on his British sky. So, those are the two versions. Version that they estimate to be around 1872, the second version, the one they estimate to be around 1878. And this isn't me estimating, listeners, this is fucking Harvard scholars, okay? So, you want to come after me? Go. Let's get a sip of coffee. If you're out doing coffee, you don't fuck with the French press, you don't know what you're missing. I didn't until I started fucking with the French press. Shout out to the French press. Anybody wants to sponsor the pod, here we go. All right, but 1213, page 535. The second version of this. Now, I've mentioned before that some of these improvements in her earlier two versions, when we had poems that had two versions like this, a first draft and second draft, that we can look at in this book. We're not going through the archives, we're not going through the scanned, scraps of paper that are in the Harvard archives and things like that. But just what's in this book. I'd said in previous episodes that a few of the revisions seem to not improve the first version. It's not true for this one. In poem 1213, page 535, the revision clearly improves it, particularly the choice of the word buccaneering instead of exercising. The bluebirds buccaneering, that not just the alliteration, but I think the way it works with the bluebirds exercising versus with the bluebirds buccaneering. Oh, come on, it's way better with buccaneering. And then the biggest change that you'll see, listeners that just are listening and don't have the page in front of them, in that second version with the first two lines, they combine the first three lines into two lines. So, we like March, period. His shoes are purple, M dash. That's the first version of 1213. The revision in 1878 is, we like March, M dash. His shoes are purple, period. He is new and high, M dash. So they changed those first two lines, combined them into one. Now, I think the revision of this one is better, but I do think that combining the we like March, his shoes are purple, is not so much an improvement, but it's not such a big deal that it ruins the poem or anything like that. There's just clearly everything else she did in this second version makes the poem better. Particularly, she includes the ending M dash on his British sky as opposed to a period after on his British sky in the 1872 version. So here we have basically putting a draft into her style, and it works for the most part. This improves it. Listeners can let me know what they think, but I think it improves it. And there's going to be more of these. I think there's a couple versions like this. All right, and then on page 5, 536, poem number 1216. This one hit me right away, particularly the fourth line of this first stanza. So here, let me read it to you. A deed knocks first at thought, and then it knocks at will. That is the manufacturing spot, and will at home and well. It then goes out and act, or is entombed so still that only to the ear of God its doom is audible. Yeah. So this idea of forming the thoughts, right? A deed knocks first at thought, and then it knocks at will, right? The thought process, then the will to do it. That is the manufacturing spot, i.e., right, manufacturing the will to do it, and will at home and well. So this idea of will going out to lunch, right? It then goes out and act, so will and thought combining into action, or is entombed so still, right, or you don't do anything, that only to the ear of God its doom is audible. And I think this just hits so hard, for me at least. I like that fourth line, and will at home and well. It's so musical. It works so well within the poem, and it hits something through so simple. There aren't big words, there aren't complex rhyme and meter. It just fits perfectly. And this is just an encapsulation of Dickinson. This is what it is. All right? Everybody knows it, everybody enjoys it. And this is where we got into the color episode, and we kind of talk about, like, I think a lot of people would ask, what's the point of a lyric poem? When I don't understand what's happening in the poem, what's the point of it? I would say the point is your misunderstanding, or not so much the point is, let me think about this. I'd say that the point is of lyric poetry, and not just to enjoy it, but there's something articulated in a lyric poem, if it's done well, right? There's a lot of bad lyric poems, that's hard to put your finger on. Not that it's not saying anything, but it's saying something that's hard to put into the concrete. And I think the reason we're drawn to somebody like Dickinson, or the reason I'm drawn to somebody like Dickinson, is because of this ability to capture something that is hard to articulate. This is the whole point, right? So when people say the point of poetry is to express the unexpressible, and I just say, okay, well, what does that mean? Basically, it's a fancy way of saying what I just said. It's saying that this captures something that I can't articulate, right? And they're saying, oh, it's unexpressible. Well, it's not unexpressible. It's just been expressed by Dickinson here, okay? It was just expressed. It was just here. It's there. It's not unexpressible. It's hard to express. And this is the art of poetry. This is the art of writing. How do you get this feeling across? How do you get this reaction in the reader? So if a lyric poem isn't giving you a concrete example or a concrete story, it's not narrative, or it's not giving you a beginning, middle, and an end, what you have is these little bits of... It relies on the brain mechanism in terms of triggering a memory, thought, idea, image in the reader. So you are anticipating the reader's reaction, and the point of a lyric poem is to manipulate the reader's reaction into what you want them to be seeing, hearing, feeling when they're reading the poem. If that makes sense. I know I kind of took a long-winded way to explain that, but that's what it is. Little guy I just want to make a note of, 1218 on page 537, another little guy that can be memorized. Let my first knowing be of thee, with morning's warming light, and my first fearing, lest unknowns, engulf thee in the night. Again, just another little one to memorize there. Another little one to memorize, and this is on page 555, poem number 1268. Confirming all who analyze in the opinion fair, that eloquence is when the heart has not a voice to spare. So this is one where I said, okay, this is a concise little perfect poem. This is a perfect little 4 lines. It captures something. And you ask yourself this, listeners, what does it make you think of? Confirming all being capitalized, who analyze. Confirming all who analyze in the opinion fair, that eloquence is when the heart has not a voice to spare. I'd say this is about passion. This is about has not a voice to spare, about giving it your all, right? About obtaining this type, that eloquence is when the heart has not a voice to spare, right? So you don't have time for anything else. You're going for it. confirming all who analyze and the opinion fair. And this idea of kind of a groupthink is what I get out of this. And, Dickinson was very against this kind of groupthink, probably because the groupthink that was common in her lifetime was telling her, she must be married, she's an old maid for not getting married, and she should be a wife and all this kind of stuff, and she should go to church, and she wasn't having that. Confirming all who analyze and the opinion fair, but all who analyze would have had that same opinion, that Dickinson's fucking up, that she's doing something wrong, right? Not with her poetry, but with her life and all that. And again, I don't want to get into biography and all that. I always say, context is nice and all, but sometimes you can talk about context until you're blue in the face, and what do we get from it, right? What does it tell us about the poem? Sometimes we get kind of overemphasized on context. I think we're going through that kind of moment now where you have a professor stand up and give a lecture, and all they talk about is the political context around some fucking poem in like the 1920s, and it is so boring, it is so reductive, and it really doesn't tell us much about the work of art in front of us. As I say, the great stuff, and Bloom says this too, Wendler says this, all the great scholars say this, good work transcends the time frame it was written in. So, sure, context is helpful. There's a place for that. I'm not going to deny that. But there is such a thing as overemphasizing context. There is such a thing as trying to pretend that we can get into the mind space and the head space of people from 1873, where this poem was estimated to be composed, and if we do that, we'll have some greater understanding of this poem that transcends the period that it was written in. And I just think that's hogwash. I think it's unprovable bullshit is what I think that is. So, let the hate mail flow. But it's unprovable bullshit. And I always say, you can talk about context till you're blue in the face. What matters is the poem right in front of you, the piece of art right in front of you. That's what matters. It isn't, you can talk about all this other stuff. You can talk about historical context. You can talk about political turmoil. You can talk about the world wars and all this kind of crap, the Civil War in terms of Dickinson and things. Walt Whitman, etc. And no doubt, like I said, that's important. It has a place. But I just think it's doing a disservice to this beautiful work of art that transcends the period it came in. I don't know what it was like to live in the 1400s in the Middle East, but I can look at the art and I can tell you whether it's good or not, what it's saying, where it's hitting me in these sweet spots. If it's hitting me nowhere, maybe I don't feel anything from it. Maybe it's dated, right? Maybe it doesn't transcend the period, but usually the great stuff, the stuff that's been canonized, is good. It transcends the context, whatever the fuck that context may be. And I just want everyone to keep that in mind as we move forward here. Okay. A couple other small ones. What did I write here? So page 556, number 1272, and page 557, number 1274. And these are both 1873 compositions. Noticed how quickly we moved from the 1868 into the 1873 now. These last 200 pages, and here we are around 50 pages into that. We already get what is huge leaps in time from her compositions. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us she wasn't writing as much. It tells us she wasn't as productive. It tells us that maybe there was something else going on. Or it tells us, she was bored. I think the boredom factor is something a lot of scholars don't give enough credit to. And you see this, especially, let's talk about Picasso. Let's say Picasso, where Picasso's blue period. Why was he doing that? Why was he restricting himself to only a few colors? Almost stick figure drawings, right? And then at the very end of his life, he was doing straight up stick figure drawings, right? Some of his famous sketches towards the end of his life. He was searching for something. He had done all the abstractionist stuff. He had done all the cubism. He had done all these other art forms, and he'd done it very successfully. He got rewarded for it. He's famous for it, etc. But even then, after all that, after all the fame, all the success, all the things that every aspiring artist wants, he was still looking for something. You're looking for the next thing. You're trying to move on. So again, I say that these got worse because maybe her health was bad, but we don't know that. I think she could have gotten bored with her own style. I think that's a very perfectly reasonable explanation as to why this started to be unfinished. She was going through mental illness problems, sure. And you start to read your work, you say, oh, that sucks. You start throwing it out. That's very plausible. Everybody does this. Everybody does this. And I think that when we look for these complicated answers in context and trying to be history professors on top of being literature professors, we miss the very simple explanations about human beings and how they do things and why. I think we're going way too far into abstraction. And again, it's usually always around, when people do go too far into the abstraction around context, political context, and things like that, it's always about comparing it to now. It's always about comparing the author, the work, what's said, well, Emily Dickinson wasn't that good, blah, blah, blah. It's just excuses people can make for ignoring the greatness of certain works of art. Okay, so let's talk about these 1272 and 1274 on page 556 and 557 here. So I didn't have a lot of notes on these, but I did want to just hit them real quick. So here's what we'll hit them. So proud she was to die, it made us all ashamed, that what we cherished, so unknown, to her desire seemed, so satisfied to go, where none of us should be. Immediately that anguish stooped, almost to jealousy. I'll let you take a guess. What do you think, listeners? What do you think of that? So proud she was to die. Oh, a martyr, right? It made us all ashamed, that what we cherished, so unknown, to her desire seemed, so satisfied to go, where none of us should be. Immediately the anguish stooped, almost to jealousy. And again, this is a tiny little poem, only a few lines. There's no stanza breaks, anything like that. But it's perfect. It talks about the stoicism at death causing anguish and jealousy. So proud she was to die. And again, this is kind of the noble, right? The noble fallacy, right? We believe we're so noble type thing. Oh, you're so noble when you die, right? As if that matters. You're still dead, right? So, and this is what we'd say is an uncharitable interpretation of somebody being stoic about their death. Be like, you know what, it happens type thing. Well, most people are like, fuck you, it happens. I'm terrified to die, right? I wish I could be as stoic about death as you. So it immediately, that anguish stooped almost to jealousy, right? You get jealous of it right away. Again, a perfect little truth. This is a little bit of humanity. This is a little piece, just one little tiny kernel of humanity in this tiny little poem from 1873, composed by one of the greatest American masters, okay? Towards the end of her life, when she was not being as productive and clearly very frustrated with her own production, her own output, the stuff she was putting onto the page, she didn't quite like it. And I think sometimes that can happen. She didn't get very much fame during her lifetime, and she didn't get very much publication during her lifetime. And I think maybe if she had, we might not have had this last 10, 15 years of her, being agoraphobic and going into locking herself in her bedroom, basically. We just wouldn't have that. All right, the other one I want to hit on before we move on, 1274 on the very next page, 557. The bone that has no marrow, what ultimate for that? It is not fit for table, for beggar, or for cat. A bone has obligations, a bean has the same, a marrowless assembly is culpabler than shame. But how shall finished creatures a function fresh obtain? O Nicodemus phantom confronting us again, right? Old Nicodemus's phantom confronting us again. Sorry, I missed that apostrophe there. A bone has obligations, a bean has the same, a marrowless assembly is culpabler than shame. Marrowless assembly, right? But how shall finished creatures a function fresh obtain? A function fresh obtain, I love, right? How shall finished creatures? So finished creatures, I would say, humans, fully formed humans, or you could even say dead creatures, right? No marrow in the bones, you've been dead for a while, right? A marrowless assembly, lots of death, lots of stuff in a graveyard, all that kind of stuff. And this is where people get caught up in her themes, and I get it, every writer has themes. But we have to be careful as readers and scholars not to assign too much onto those. Unless, of course, they need to be, right? This is all circumstantial. All right, let's keep moving. On page 560, we have another of these two versions, right? Another two-version poem. And that one is number 1282. Page 560. And I don't want to go into this as much, but because it isn't changed as much as other versions. But these are called, they're not saying unfinished, they're saying there's rough draft 1 and rough draft 2. And these are believed to be composed in the same year, 1873. So we didn't have a long gap between poems, which is normal, right? We can have long gaps between different versions of different poems. As I always say, this is why I say, listeners, be organized. Be organized with your drafts. Treat them as something sacred, because sometimes the things you're looking for come to you years apart, and it's just easier to deal with that when you get the answer that it just, that electricity runs through your brain and you start to think, oh my God, I just figured it out. I just finally know how to end that poem. Well, are you going to be able to find that poem that you started writing years ago, and put that ending in it? That's the difference between, success and failure, okay? That's the difference between composing masterpieces and not, okay? So, yeah, treat it as sacred. You know what? I'm not going to read this. I need to move on. I've already been talking for an hour here by myself. Another little one to memorize before we move on, page 562, number 1287. In this short life that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power? Again, this idea of life, right? It's so short. We are so powerless over so much. And we pretend we aren't, right? We pretend that we aren't powerless over all this kind of stuff, that we can't control the weather. We can't control all these things in our life. But it only lasts an hour. How much, how little is within our power? Again, not the most broad, not the most expansive poem, and there's very little punctuation. It seems like maybe a little scrap, maybe a little draft, but a fun little one to memorize. You can bring up at cocktail parties, things like that. Okay. Here's the one I wanted to talk about. Page 563, poem number 1290. And I would say this is basically Dickinson at her best. Let me read it to you. The most pathetic thing I do is play I hear from you. I make believe until my heart almost believes it too. But when I break it with the news, you knew it was not true. I wish I had not broken it, Goliath, so would you. Dickinson at her best. I think it's perfectly metered, perfectly separated, perfectly rhymed with this stuff, right? Very simple. Very simple, yet very vulnerable. And this is something I think that isn't talked about enough in Dickinson's work, is that she's able to capture this kind of, those hard to describe feelings of vulnerability that we all feel throughout our life, throughout our life, because this was written in 1873. This is something all humans fucking experience, okay? It transcends being written in 1873. So could I look up all the political context? Could I look up all the fucking, geography and bullshit? Yeah, I could. What is that going to tell me? Is that going to give me more insight into this universalism that is all over this poem? Is it? I don't think so. I don't think it is. The most pathetic thing I do is play I hear from you. And again, how many of you do this? How many people out there listening? I know everybody does it, which is why I'm asking it. It's rhetorical, right? I make believe until my heart almost believes it too, right? And I'm guilty of this. And I've been trying to stop doing this, where I have this kind of idea in my head. And I start extrapolating it. I start creating scenes around it. I start creating motivations for the characters, whether those be fictional, whether those be my friends, whether that be whoever, I start to imagine conversations. I start to imagine what I would say, what I would do, what this imagined person, this character would say back to me. And I'm trying to stop doing that because I've listeners, let me know what you think about this, but I started thinking that it's a waste of creative energy. That for me to create fake conversations in my head, maybe it serves a purpose. I'm not a psychologist. Anybody who knows more than me, please, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's a waste of creative energy, that I could be putting that energy into something creative, into my projects, into my poems, into my stories, into my books, right? The things that I've been trying to work on, the things that I've been trying to get published for a few years now, okay? And I've just been trying to be like, that's wasteful. Why am I putting all this energy into this fake conversation in my head? Dickinson tells us, well, because I'm a human, okay? Because all human beings do this. Everybody does this. And she captured it. And she wasn't the first to capture it, but she captured it in 1873. This is where I say, you want context? Suck my dick. You want context, okay? Here we go. Okay, page 572, poem number 1320. And the reason I marked this one, and at least I just wanted to talk about it, bring it to your attention, this one is left justified. It's one of the only poems of hers that's left justified. And remember, listeners, most of her stuff was handwritten. There wasn't really much more than handwritten at the time. Even typewriters and stuff weren't really... God, I don't know this. I'm just speaking out of my ass now, but I don't know when typewriters were invented or when they were common. Even for wealthy people could have typewriters, but I do not know if that was the case here. I don't think so. But, we'll find out. Listeners, put that in the comments. Let me know. I don't want to be spreading false shit around, but, not like it matters in today's world. 1320. Dear March, come in. How glad I am. I hoped for you before. Put down your hat. You must have walked. How out of breath you are. Dear March, how are you? And the rest. Did you leave nature well? Oh, March, come right upstairs with me. I have so much to tell. I got your letter, and the birds. The maples never knew that you were coming, till I called. I declare how red their faces grew. But March, forgive me, and all those hills you left for me to hew. There was no purple suitable. You took it all with you. Who knocks? That April. Lock the door. I will not be pursued. He stayed away a year to call, when I am occupied. But trifles look so trivial as soon as you have come, that blame is just as dear as praise, and praise as mere as blame. Longer one. Not the best poem. I think it's a little overdone, and the lines clearly aren't as tight as her usual stuff, particularly in that looks like third stanza. She has a couple really long lines. The maples never knew that you were coming till I called was just the longest line in the poem. I think that she probably would have edited that out eventually. I also think the idea is a little muddled, where you're kind of this March, April, kind of incoming of spring, right? And I think this gets back to the religious context of lion versus lamb, right? The stuff, right? What do they say? In like a lion, out like a lamb type thing. Yeah, I think this has to do with that. But now it makes me think maybe she didn't left justify this at all. Maybe it was fucking editors putting their fat, greedy hands in her work, and she didn't left justify this. But again, I don't know, and we'll never know, again, because there's just such poor record keeping, such poor scholarship on so much literature. But here we go. So page 577, poem number 1331. This one I marked because I think it's another good idea. This captures the kind of sentiment over all else that Dickinson is very good at, that we've come to know for everything she's done. So wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not, a beautiful but bleak condition. He has not lived who has not felt. Suspense is his maturer sister, whether adult delight is pain, or of itself a new misgiving. This is the gnat that mangles men. This idea, wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not, a beautiful but bleak condition. He has not lived who has not felt. So again, this idea of a very simple idea, wonder and all, right? And it's how it's kind of this in-between thing. It's in between. It's hard to describe because it's in between. Really, the only thing we can get to describe it is, okay, you get some type of modern psychology textbook that can boringly describe it to you in the kind of chemical reactions in your fucking head. Okay, we could do that. Sure, we could. Or, listeners, we could do Dickinson. We could do what Dickinson did. We could take Dickinson's idea of wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not, right? It's an in-between thing. It's an intuition. It's a feeling that everybody has. We've been trying for centuries to explain it, to write it down, to capture it. All the great poets have tried, and Dickinson here is succeeding. And she's not necessarily saying what it is, but she's capturing what it is, right? Does that make sense? Tell me if it doesn't make sense, I guess. But she's capturing Not what that in between space is, but showing you what it does, right? So as she moves on in this poem here, a beautiful but bleak condition, right? He has not lived who has not felt. So you haven't lived if you haven't felt this wonder of in between knowing and not knowing, right? Suspense is his mature sister, whether adult delight is pain, or of itself a new misgiving. This is the gnat that mangles men. And the idea of comparing it to a gnat, this kind of little pestering thing that flies around, right? Comparing this stuff, a misgiving, right? Mangles son, and it can eat you up, right? It can mangles men. It mangles men. This little tiny thing can mangle people. And of course, she's using men as the universal here. Although I think people would kind of be like, "Oh, well, she's doing something feminist critiquing men." No, she's talking about. This is where context does matter, right? She's using the phrase as it would have been used then. Men stood for universal, all people. Then, right? And okay, sure, that's sexism. Sure, it is. Yes, it is. But again, what are we going to do about it? What can we do? We can't go back and change it. All right. We just have to understand the context. And this is where context would be useful. This is a good example of it. But yeah, okay, let's move on from this. And this is, as I'm moving through here, we're going through 1875, 1874, and where am I headed here? I'm headed for page 586. Okay, let me turn there. And this is another one. We have a lot of versions. So 1876, 1877. And this is where I say, okay, sometimes we need to speculate about her because images of rats keep coming up. They keep coming up. Where do you see rats, listeners? Just let me, not any specific poem here, but if you read through these last 200 pages, the image of rats seem to come much more into these poems between like the kind of 1875, 1876 area. It could be just me. Maybe I'm just noticing something I didn't notice before. But I think that rats did become more prominent as a theme in these works. And why would that be? Well, where do you see rats, right? You usually don't see rats unless you can go out in the field, you'll see a field mouse or something. You really don't see rats unless they're like, they hoard places. They hoard in the pantries, they hoard in garbage bins, dumpsters, right? They build nests underneath these food sources. In walls, in abandoned chambers. So if she was sitting in her room all day, every day, all night, right? She was in her room, barely letting the servants come in and change her bedpans and things, right? Yes, I think people forget about that too. So she was locked in her room with a bowl filled with her own shit and piss, right? It's kind of like these fucking little porcelain pot that you shit and piss in. And then the servants would usually come, if you were rich like Emily Dickinson, and change it out, right? So she was sitting in her own fucking shit and piss. That'll attract some rats. And I think when you're really isolated like that, you start to befriend people. They talk about this in jail. That's like a common thing in movies and tropes and things. When you're in jail, you start making friends with the rats, right? You start making friends with the spiders, all the little insects that get through the cracks of a building, right? Make their home in it. We talked about this a little bit with Renfield and the spiders and the insects, right? When he was clearly going crazy, and they was meant to show that he was going crazy because he's eating these bugs, but he was becoming friends with these things, right? That's all he had. And there's, it's stupid, but I'm thinking of that movie Newsies, that Disney movie. Anybody seen that? It's young Christian Bale. This is a dumb story, but it's actually one of my favorite Disney musicals that came out during kind of 90s era. And I know it was a flop. Most people don't like it. They think it's dumb, it's corny, but I love it. It's one of my favorite Disney musicals, and there's a scene in that where Crutchy at the end, they get vindicated, they get the bad guy, and Crutchy turns to the commissioner and he just says, the first thing you gotta do in jail, make friends with the rats, right? That was like a little joke that he threw in there, and it stuck with me. And it's dumb, although I would encourage everybody to listen to it. It's on Disney Plus. Go watch that movie. It's a little longer than a lot of their musicals, but it is okay. So the reason that musical is in my life and represents something to me is my grandfather was a newsie in Baltimore City in the 30s during the Great Depression. And when Disney made this movie about the newsies, and they're doing New York in the movie, I think it's Brooklyn and stuff. They're talking about the boroughs, but that was at every major city in the U.S. at the time. And my grandfather would sell papers, and because of that, when that movie came out, he took us all to see it. And he took us, he bought the tapes and we would watch it with him and things like that. It's one of my most, not cherished memories, but it's a very poignant memory in my life. And learning that my grandfather would tell me stories about basically being a newsie. Yeah, literally 8 years old, Baltimore City, 1930s, Great Depression. He was standing on the corner holding up papers and shouting, extra, extra, or whatever, read all about it, right? The evening edition and stuff. And he said there were perks, right? Because he was a newsboy, he'd get thrown ice blocks. They'd throw him chips from the ice wagons and cars that would go through the city on those hot summer days. Again, you see this in movies and stuff. It was real. It's a real thing that happened. And then he always said his biggest joy of being a newsboy was when he was a little boy. Because he was a newsie, they let him get into sports games for free at the old stadiums downtown. And he'd tell me that, yeah, he would get in. His favorite part was getting into the Army Navy games for free. Usually football. He was a football guy. He taught me most of what I know, about football, sports, all that. But I guess that's off topic. But, well, yeah, that's a long way of saying, we make friends in unusual places, right? When you have to, Castaway, Tom Hanks, right? Talking to a fucking volleyball. Why is he talking to a volleyball? Because we're fucking social, man. That's why. Volleyball was his pet, his friend. The rat is your friend. And I don't know, I just noticed this in Dickinson's work, and I know I'm getting way off topic here, but, what do you think? Let me know what you think in the comments, all that kind of stuff. All right, well, let's talk about this one then. Page 586, 1357, and then I'll get to 588, 1366, because these are a couple different versions start to take place now in 1876. We're not going to read these. Okay, fuck this. But again, there's two more versions for 1357 and 1358. There's two versions of these again, and they became more frequent as we went through these last 200 pages. Let me go to 588. Okay. One thing I do want to point out before I move to 1366, 1364 on the same page 588 in this version. The first line of poem 1364 is, "How know it from a summer's day? Its fervors are as firm." And all I got from that was Shakespeare, screaming Shakespeare sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art far more lovely and more temperate, right? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, blah, blah, blah. Right, okay, keep going. Right, I'm just doing this memory. I don't have the whole thing memorized, but you should memorize a couple Shakespeare sonnets, okay. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out. How know it from a summer's day, right? How do you know it from a summer's day? Yeah, okay. But also on page 588, poem number 1366, they have it separated into these three groups, A, B, and C. So we have 1366A, 1366B, 1366C. And they're very small. They're very, very, very small. And they're kind of all estimated between the years 1876 and 1880. They're not very good poems. They're very little. The dates seem to be all over the place, which leads me to believe that she was trying to work through this for a couple years and maybe it couldn't get anywhere. But, and this is where I started to notice that, yes, the poems do seem to be shorter, more unfinished, not worked out to the way that they should be, the way that we're used to with a lot of Dickinson stuff. And what can we do about that? A lot of people do this towards the end of their life. When somebody dies, a writer dies, we find their works. We find the stuff they didn't publish, and we're like, oh my God. I saw this too with Hemingway, right? And it was might have been a year or two ago where I saw this. And it might have been Harper's or somebody published, a previously unpublished Hemingway story. And they said, oh, exclusive. This is a short story from Hemingway that was never published. I saw a lot of people, a lot of prominent literary people shitting all over it, saying, I could write better than that. Hemingway wasn't that good. I'm a really good writer. I'm definitely not just snarking online. Yeah, okay. And they were shitting on it. And I just thought to myself, oh, wow. You mean one of Hemingway's lesser stories? A story that he thought wasn't good enough to publish isn't as good as his masterpieces? Oh, who would have thought? And of course, these people are convinced that they're geniuses because they noticed that this story isn't as good as his masterpieces that were published during his lifetime. Yeah, he didn't think so either. It's why it wasn't fucking published before, okay? It's literally there for fans. It's there for connoisseurs, collectors, people to appreciate. That's all it's there for. And all this kind of critique, all this, oh, his style is dated because 100 years later we don't write like that. Yeah, okay, dude. Like these people, that's what I mean. Be very careful who you're listening to for your literary opinions. One, because most people don't actually read the books they're talking about. They're repeating what they heard from either a teacher, a Harper's article, or somebody they follow on social media, okay? That's really it. And I just, I don't want to rant on this. I don't want to rant on this, so I'll just stop. But, all right, I'm going to pee. I'll be right back, guys. Yeah, but, that's how I feel about that. All right, we're about halfway. Okay, we talked about those 3-section poems and blah, blah, blah. Next page, 596. About halfway here, 596. And the reason, I'm covering more in these first 100 pages because you'll see if you read this, listeners, the last, 100 pages or so, it really falls apart and it really starts to be not sad, but it is a little bit like, ooh, she's losing it, right? You see this, we see this all the time. We see this with our favorite, artists, it's hard to maintain. Even if you're at the peak, you can peak and you can. One of the things I try to do, and I'm interested in listeners' ideas on this too, so, let us know. Send a comment, send an email, what you do to keep yourself from getting burned out. Do you do breaks? Do you do breaks? Do you do things like timed writing sessions? You don't want to get so worked up over something that you lose sight of something else, right? But yeah, let me know. And I'm going to try and get, some more writers on the podcast. We'll start talking to them about things like this too, listeners. But yeah, all that good stuff. There will be changes coming, and not just me being solo, but yeah, we're gonna mess around and experiment with this thing too. So, and this, listeners, we want to know what you want. What do you like? What would you like to see me read? What would you like to see me go over, give my takes on? But yeah. Okay. Page 596, poem number 1389. My notes for this one are just say perfect. God, what a master, right? Okay, so here we go. Touch lightly nature's sweet guitar, unless thou knowest the tune, or every bird will point at thee, because a bard too soon. Now, this one's definitely about writing, right? I think everybody knows it's definitely about writing. And it's again, touch lightly nature's sweet guitar, unless thou knowest the tune, or every bird will point at thee, because a bard too soon. And this kind of, I think a lot of writers, a lot of artists fear this. We fear blossoming too soon. And I know a lot of people say, oh, you haven't been born as a writer yet. And sometimes that's partly true, right? It takes a lot of work to do something like this. It takes a lot of work to write something to completion. We've talked about this on previous episodes. I'll continue to talk about it because it's important, and it's something I think not enough writers talk about, not because they're embarrassed, but because it's kind of like the ugly work at the factory, right? We don't want to see, the sweatshop with the slaves in it making our iPhone. We want to see the iPhone on a pretty little box on the shelf, okay? Right? We don't want to talk about the factory sweatshop. And I get why writers don't want to talk about that, but it's just part of it. Let's be honest. It's just part of it. All right, let's go to page 597 here for poem number 1392. And this is a very famous one. Hope is a strange invention is the first line. You might know it by that one. Very, very famous. I was going to let Sophie take this one, but of course I'm running solo, so I don't have a whole lot of notes on this one. But I'll do what I can. I'll read it at the very least. Hope is a strange invention, a patent of the heart, in unremitting action, yet never wearing out. Of this electric adjunct, not anything is known, but its unique momentum embellish all we own. And what is it saying, right? It's hope, right? Yeah, it's talking about hope. Yes, of course. Hope is a strange invention, though. A patent of the heart, in unremitting action, yet never wearing out. So this unremitting action, never wearing out. We were just talking about burning out, right? But hope. this kind of endless flame, this kind of endless call to action, this kind of endless thing. And it's perpetuated inside the heart or inside the human body, right? It's perpetuated in here. Of this electric adjunct, not anything is known, but its unique momentum embellish all we own, right? This idea, we don't know much about it, but we know it embellishes almost everything. It covers it. It slathers everything we do. We're like, hope, hope. It's fucking slogans. It's political slogans. It's marketing campaign slogans. It's hope. Yeah, sorry, I wish I had more to say on this one, but it's been talked about, written about to death. You guys can look it up. All right, I'm turning to page 615, poem number 1449. And we're in 1878 with this one now. We've moved through. We're getting into the final, 100 pages here. The last 100 pages of Dickinson's work, which is, I don't want to sound grandiose, or I don't want to sound like I'm overemphasizing something, but reading complete works, especially of canonized artists, and I'm not talking about just some fucking random person, or, if you like that person, you like that artist, read their complete works, consume their complete works, watch all their movies, read all their books, save PDFs of all their fucking masterpiece painting, whatever it is, okay, do that. But it lets you see beginning, middle, and end. You can see beginning, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not everything is a masterpiece. Not everything comes out the way you want it. Not everything can be worked into success or a complete structurally sound work of art, okay? Not everything can be. Some ideas get left on the table. Some ideas get left behind. It's just the way it is, okay? But this one, on page 615, poem number 1449, it struck me, I've struggled to articulate why. Let's see if I can do it here. But this one struck me as a love poem. It struck me as a love poem in a couple different ways. Now here, let me read it to you, and then we'll discuss here. I thought the train would never come. How slow the whistle sang. I don't believe a peevish bird so whimpered for the spring. I taught my heart 100 times precisely what to say. Provoking lover, when you came, its tristy flew away. To hide my strategy too late, to wiser be too soon, for miseries so halcyon, the happiness atone. I thought the train would never come. Simple enough, right? Simple enough. The image of waiting for a train, so she means that literally, right? But then, of course, it's poetry, so we can't just rely on the literal. She means more than that. She means the metaphor of waiting for a train, right? How slow the whistle sang. I don't believe a peevish bird so whimpered for the spring. I taught my heart 100 times precisely what to say. Who hasn't done that, right? Who hasn't gone over and over and over again in their head what they'd say to a lover? Provoking lover, when you came, its tristy flew away. So this idea of love as a bird, love singing for the spring, all this kind of, or the bird singing for the spring, same as humans singing for love, all this good stuff. And it struck me. It struck me as this is about love. This is a love poem. This is about the gradual coming to love, coming to understand what it is, this human emotion, this human experience. And I think people don't understand what it isn't too, right? There's this, we romanticize love. We romanticize relationships, not just in this culture, but every culture. We romanticize it. And I get it because it feels very good inside. We get those human emotions where we kind of go, yeah, that feels really good. We romanticize love, and we kind of think that it's supposed to play out like a fucking movie. Like it's supposed to play out in some predetermined, imagined way, and it doesn't, right? It never does. And this, its tristy flew away, right? Provoking lover, when you came, right? Even no matter how hard you try, you want it to go one way. You have this sets of expectations, and then those expectations not being met because they're not realistic. They're fantasies in someone's head, right? And I think we talked about this a little bit on the Oleana Davis episode, number 32, I believe. episode number 32. Listeners can go back and listen to that, where she mentions this. She talks about this. And she was talking about it in the context of a marriage ending. I think that's clear from the poetry. And of course, if you want to go biography with that, you can look at her divorce and things. I don't like to go too hard into biography, although of course you can gleam a little things from it. I'm not going to deny you can glean a little bit of information from it. Hold on, we got a dog chorus here. And moving on with this theme of hope, this idea of things in our head. Page 616, poem 1451. Whoever disenchants a single human soul by failure of irreverence is guilty of the whole. As guileless as a bird, as graphic as a star, till the suggestion sinister, things are not what they are. And again, this little great poem about truth, and not just truth, but the negative or ugly aspect of truth, right? Whoever disenchants a single human soul by failure of irreverence is guilty of the whole. So this is kind of the tell the truth but tell it slant. Same theme, right? When you disenchant somebody, in this case a human soul in the poem, but we can broaden that out. We can mean humans, we can mean humanity, we can mean an individual, human soul, is guilty of the whole, right? So if you disenchant somebody's belief, if you tell them the truth and don't tell it slant, you're guilty. You're guilty of something. They're going to accuse you of something. You will be, it's the crucible. It's a witch trial, right? Things are not what they are. And this is, you hear that saying, the cliche, ignorance is bliss. You know why that cliche sticks around? It's because it's true. It's because ignorance is bliss. When you don't know something, you can't be upset by it. You can't be disenchanted. You can't be, too bright for an infirm delight. You can't be shocked into knowing something new or have your worldview crumble. It won't happen. And we're happy. We're usually, human beings, we're happy with that. The less you know, right? The burden of truth, maybe, is what I'm getting at. This idea that to be a truth teller or a truth, quote unquote, knower, right, is a burden. It's a burden, particularly when the truth disenchants a widely held belief. For example, the earth is flat or something. What happened to the people that suggested the earth wasn't flat? Well, they were put in jail, they were hung, they were burned at the stake because they disenchanted a single human soul. So they were guilty of the whole, right? And we're moving through to 1879, but on page 623, poem number 1472, it's a little fragment. Again, I think this is an unfinished little fragment. That's my guessing at what it is, how it feels to me when I read it on the page. It doesn't feel complete. And I'm going to try and explain that to you. I'm going to try and explain why it doesn't feel complete to me. Maybe I'll fail at it, but here we go. To see the summer sky is poetry, though never in a book it lie. True poems flee. True poems flee. And this little fragment, I think, captures a lot about writing in terms of this kind of beauty versus truth, etc. This kind of call back to Keats, obviously, in some way, if we're talking beauty and truth, right? Calling back to that Keats. But to see the summer sky is poetry, though never in a book it lie. True poems flee. And lie is spelled L-I-E here, as in to lie, tell a lie, right? True poems flee. True poems flee. They leave. They're not remembered. Tell the truth, but tell it slant. And I think this is something people get confused. To see the summer sky is poetry, though never in a book it lie. True poems flee. So to say that poetry is trying to capture the summer sky, or just the picture of the summer sky, or seeing the summer sky, is poetry, though it can't be captured. It can't be in a book. If it is in a book, it's a lie, right? True poems flee. Poems that can't be pinned down. Truth, beauty, these things that are so hard to capture, so hard to explain in a work of art, so hard to put on the page. That's what she's talking about. And I don't want to talk about, anything can be a poem. That's not true. That's not true at all. You know that if you're a listener to this podcast, but I think it is there. But you can let me know what you think about that. Okay, on page 626, poem number 1483. I marked this one because it's a little different, and I think it strikes a level of maturity that breaks through in these later poems. So a lot of these later poems are incomplete. They're fragments, at least they feel that way when I'm reading through them. They feel like practice poems, fragments, things she didn't finish because of whatever reason. But this one's finished. This one strikes me as a very mature rendition of Dickinson's style. And this was composed circa 1880, we're estimating. So it would make sense that it's much more mature. So if her peak year was 1862, 1880, okay, so what are we, right? We're 18 years? Almost 20 years between her peak 1862 compositions and this. Let me read it to you. So, the robin is a Gabriel in humble circumstances. His dress denotes him socially, of transport's working classes. He has the punctuality of the New England farmer, the same oblique integrity, a vista vastly warmer, a small but sturdy residence, a self-denying household, the guests of perspicacity. The guests of perspicacity are all that cross his threshold, as covert as a fugitive, cajoling consternation, by ditties to the enemy and sylvan punctuation. I just thought of how mature this poem was, how you can see in her style everything that we've been talking about over these last, 10 hours of talking about Dickinson's complete works. It is all coming to fruition here later in her life, 1880, and she's able to give us something a little different, but not really so different that it doesn't fit or anything like that. But it's very mature, more mature than other ones. The robin is a Gabriel. Of course, she means Gabriel, the angel from the Bible, right? In humble circumstances, his dress denotes him socially, of transport's working classes. So, here we are. Let's move on. So, on page 638, poem 1525, we have another asterisk here, and it's calling us to poem 1616. It's on page 666. So let me mark that and turn to it real quick, and I'll read you both of these. And this is the same thing like the balls upon the floor type poem that we read earlier, where we have the kind of a revision or another verse or rewriting of the final verse here. So let me read this to you. So the 1525, and this is circa 1881 version. He lived the life of ambush and went the way of dusk. And now against his subtle name there stands an asterisk. As confident of him as we, impregnable we are, the whole of immortality entrenched within a star. And then the 1616 version, who abdicated ambush and went the way of dusk. And now against his subtle name there stands an asterisk. As confident of him as we, impregnable we are, the whole of immortality secreted in a star. And that was composed around 1884, circa 1884. So we have about 3 years separation between these two revisions, or what they're calling related revisions in this version. What I'm thinking of this is, why did Dickinson do this? Why? Okay, so the easy answer is, well, she was writing, right? So sometimes you do a revision years later, and it works out. And I would say maybe the first version is better. It's hard to say. I haven't looked at it enough, but, it's there. And this is 1881 versus 1884, too. So 3 years separated, and she's going back to rewrite this poem. I guess she just wasn't happy with it, or again, this is only speculate. We can only speculate because we don't know. And then the kind of easy explanation is she was just revising. She was writing a different version. And these are both included because when you're reading the complete works, you need to know both. Now, here's another one I wanted to point out, and this is more of criticism. So on page 642, poem number 1539, and this was composed circa 1882, from what we know, or at least Johnson's guessing here. Now I lay thee down to sleep, I pray the Lord thy dust to keep, and if thou live before thou wake, I pray the Lord thy soul to take. that I pray the Lord thy soul to make. Sorry, she was doing a variation of the prayer, right? I pray the Lord my soul to take. And she was purposely subverting that. Now, the reason I marked this for criticism, this seems like, I'm going to say this, but don't take this the wrong way. This seems like the laziest of her prayer type poems, where she's subverting the prayer or the expected use of the phrasing in a prayer that's been handed down by Christian faith, right? And it's strange in this way that it's barely clever. It's not as clever as her stuff that's usually doing this. It's shorter, so it really doesn't expand on the idea at all. But it just struck me as strange. It struck me as something's going on where the poems are getting shorter, they're getting less clever, they're getting less biting. Maybe is a good descriptor. They're less biting. They're more. I don't know. How would you describe this? And now I lay thee down to sleep. I pray the Lord thy dust to keep. And if thou live before thou wake, I pray the Lord thy soul to make. It's honestly more positive than some of her other stuff. And it's about, the actual prayer is kind of dark. You pray it. Traditionally, people would pray this type of thing before bed, right? And they'd be like, I pray the Lord my soul to take if I die before I wake, right? And she does the if thou live before thou wake, I pray the Lord thy soul to make instead of to take. And I don't know, it just struck me as terribly unclever, lazy, and it, nothing against this. This is one poem, in thousands, a poem that is over 1,700 poems here, and this is one that I just think is not quite working. Clearly an exercise, clearly something she didn't write another draft of, so she didn't think that was worth it. But there it is. You can let me know if you think it's lazy or you think it's incredibly clever. It'd be hard pressed to convince me, but okay. And then on page 647, poem 1554. And I marked this because as I was reading through the last, 100 pages of this collection, a lot of it was disappointing. A lot of it was Dickinson. I keep saying losing it, or I keep saying, but I don't mean like losing her ability or anything like that. I mean losing the spark or the drive that made her so productive in those previous years, and 1862 being the peak. But here's another one that just struck me as more than the others. So I marked this one because it was just better than some of what I was reading in this last bit here. So 1554, go tell it, what a message, to whom is specified, not murmur, not endearment, but simply we obeyed. Obeyed, a lure, a longing, O nature, none of this. To law, said sweet Thermopylae, I give my dying kiss. And this one is marked very, almost overdone with the M dashes, but it's so much M dash that it actually works, I think, to pace it out. So again, it was just better than the other ones. She was experimenting still, it looks like, even when she was not being as productive. And it's normal, right? I'm experimenting all the time. I'm experimenting on books. I have a book of poems that I'm working on right now that's kind of an experiment in terms of the craft, what it can do. But as usual, I don't talk about books that aren't out yet. Because the book could never come out. It could never come out. It could be a complete fucking failure. So there's that possibility. But around this time, around the 1884, 1885 parts of the book, as you move through here, it seems very strange. It seems like she almost can't get anything out that she actually wants to get out. It seems like she's really struggling to get these poems out of herself, right? And I was, again, this is where I got into biography, which I don't like overemphasizing, but like I've said, listen, it has its place. We just have to be careful not to overemphasize it. And I think I'm trying to be. But it did make me wonder, was this when she was locking herself up in her room? Because if you're locking yourself in your room and you're isolating yourself from the rest of the world, there is no way you can possibly interact with the world to compose poems and things. So her poems don't hit as hard. They're not as memorable. They're not about these kind of universal truths as much anymore. They're more narrow. They're more lost. That's why I kept seeing, like, I said strained. They seem strained. It seems like she's straining herself to reach. And, we all age, we all get older. This is very close to her death here, 1886-ish, right? Very, very close. So, and I just want to make the point that it's clear, her art seems to be suffering because she had a mental illness that prevented her from seeing, the forest from the trees clearly, and she couldn't trim stuff down. And also an interesting thing to note here around page 674, 675, we start to lose the date estimation. And we talked about this on previous episodes. Some estimated dates were, had question marks next to them. We didn't know if they were composed at that time. We're just estimating, we're guesstimating, we're using other things to help us determine when these might have been composed. But around the last 40, 50 pages here, there are no dates. It's all question marks where the dates were leading up to this. So we don't know when exactly these were composed, although some have dates here and there. They're all circa estimates, but right after 1880s, we just don't know. We don't know. It hurts our scholarship. It hurts our scholarship if we don't know. We can't determine what's causing it to be this way, or why. I don't know. I mean, you can see this. You can just feel it. I don't know how else to describe it right now, except you can feel it. You can feel that these poems feel out of place. They feel unfinished. They feel like scraps. They feel like, exercises that she was doing daily, as all writers should. You should be doing daily exercises and things like that. But it doesn't quite work. And you can see her kind of lose the magic. I don't know. Listeners can think what they want. They can disagree with me on that, but I think it's there. And all these undated ones, I have to say, I don't know if it was just because I was, reading the last 200 pages of this, and this has been something I've been reading for a long time, that I was getting, burnt out or done with it. But I think, based on my readings for the other sections, that it's around this page 675 that it just starts to be very lackluster. It just starts to reach that point where, she was basically just a sick, older woman at that time. But, that being said, there was one poem that I marked at the end. Really, I think there were two. Yeah, two. And these are the two that I thought were really good in the later bunch here, where we don't have dates. We can't really determine when they were written, but they're put in here. On page 698, poem 1718. This is the one I marked where I just thought this was the best in the later bunch of poems that I was reading through. So, drowning is not so pitiful as the attempt to rise. 3 times, 'tis said, a sinking man comes up to face the skies, and then declines forever to what abhorred abode, where hope and he part company, for he is grasped of God. The Maker's cordial visage, however good to see, is shunned, we must admit it, like an adversity. I fucked up the reading of that last one there, you heard it, but still, this one I thought was really good. Drowning is not so pitiful as the attempt to rise, right? Where hope and he part company, so death, right? The hope of living is what she equates to death in this poem particularly, but she does this in a lot of poems, For he is grasped of God. The Maker's cordial visage, however good to see, is shunned, we must admit it, like an adversity. There it is. There it is. And this one was published 1896, so this is one of the first collections here that it came out. So everybody recognized how good this was. All the other poems around it weren't released until 1945 when Harvard released her whole collections, the books like this. But 1896, so everybody saw how good this poem was. Everybody saw, these editors, these people that knew, they understood, just like I do here. This poem is better than the rest in this bunch. All right. And this is the final poem. This is the final poem here, listeners. We made it the whole time. Final poem I marked was on page 702, number 1732. And I marked, I don't know why I think this is so famous. I think this is famous, but don't quote me on that. I'm not a big Dickinson expert, but I do like it. So, my life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me, so huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven, and all we need of hell. Yeah, that just seems very, like I've heard it before. It has to be a famous poem. My life closed twice before it's closed. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me, right? So there's two closes and then it closed. So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Again, no date on this one. We don't know when it was written. But again, nice little poem, famous one. And she's talking about the events, right? Going to death, life, all the big themes that she hits at. If immortality unveil a third event to me, right? So if you don't die, my life closed twice before it's closed, so I died twice before I died. It yet remains to see, right? We could think of it that way, at least. If immortality unveil a third event to me, so another time of dying or something else. So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Parting. And again, it's kind of a jab at the church, right? Parting is all we know of heaven. So all we know of heaven is that we go there when we die, in terms of that, and all we need of hell, right? And that's it. That is it. We've hit it. We've hit the complete poems of Emily Dickinson. The whole fucking book, listeners. The whole fucking book. And that's it. All right. Reminder to listeners, we're still looking for workshop horror stories. If you or someone you know had a terrible experience in a writing workshop, send that in to heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. We'd like to start a segment on that. Those that don't know, we do have a subscription plan. Subscribe to this podcast at patreon.com/heavyboard, and you will receive full uncensored episodes, bonuses, all that good stuff for subscribers only. If you don't want to do that, can't afford it, there are other ways to support us. You can leave us a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You could also check out our YouTube channels. We are at Heavyboard on YouTube and at Heavyboard Clips. Both those channels, we offer free videos, free versions of our podcast on those channels, and the Clips channel obviously just has clips, but they're free. Please like, subscribe, share those with your friends and family. Those help us out, helps us grow. It's a free way to support us. And as always, the links to all the books and shit we covered are in the description. And next week we are doing Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. And that's what I'm looking forward to, listeners. It's one of my favorite books. Vonnegut's one of my favorite writers. And we're going to hit that bad boy hard. All right. This has been Heavy Board. See ya.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! You know,
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources. American resources.
Being bored,
Some activities are intentional, right?
it shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom,
Heavy.
I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.